This is the time of the year when effectively intellect stops in Cambridge and all sorts of joyous activities begin, but we are actually keeping the intellect going this evening. My name is Christopher Bailey. I am the convener of the World History Seminar, which happens during the term every week and brings people together from very different fields to discuss the important historical issues and issues which bear more on the contemporary. We have actually in Cambridge begun to develop a more important Middle East element over the last few years. For a time, history has never embraced the Middle East, West Asia, North Africa very considerably. We now have actually a position, a senior position in that area. And we've also had a tremendous amount of support from graduate students who are beginning to develop an interest in the area. And Jason has been involved in that as well. So it's wonderful to have you here this evening, and particularly to welcome you to really rejoice in this book. And I've been looking at it over the lunch period, and I think it's of absolutely great significance. It obviously deals with something which is very much on our minds at the moment, but it also has a tremendous historical range and depth. And as some of the very interesting comments on the back say, this is not something which is going to disappear when this issue becomes resolved, if it's ever resolved. So today's session is a struggle for the post-Qadhafi future, Islamists, militias, and foreign powers. And it's introduced by Jason, and I think it's remarkable that Jason, who is a graduate student beginning to write his chapters, has already written a tremendous amount of very wonderful published work in all sorts of journals, but has also edited a book. It's very few graduate students at his stage that have done that. And of course he's done it because he has a tremendous depth of knowledge of the Middle East and of Libya in particular over many, many years. So I think what I'll do is ask Jason to introduce the book, to say why he got there, how he's interested in Libya in the first place, what sort of ideas he developed out of his experiences in Libya, and how he sees the future. But also to say something about the book itself. So, Jason, would you like to?
Thank you. And welcome to this special session of the World History Seminar. Thank you, Professor Bailey, for that very warm and lovely introduction, and of course for letting this event take place under the auspices of the seminar. For those of you who know how things tend to go at these academic seminars, here's a little disclaimer. This is a panel, it's a book launch, and as you can see there are some copies floating around and you have your discount order forms. So things are going to be a little different than a regular Cambridge seminar. We're not presenting an academic paper, and we hope to be giving you something a little more personal, our specific experiences or perspectives on the uprisings in Libya and interpretations of what that means for the future. Now it's my honor to introduce the other panelists. On my left we have Ambassador Richard Northern, who's currently director of the RN4 consultancy and a senior consultant to the International Hospital Group, which recently signed so far the most significant deal in trying to build hospitals in Libya, which is very exciting. Before that he was a British diplomat for 35 years, serving in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Italy, and Canada, before being Her Majesty's ambassador to Libya from May 2010 to August 2011. And to my right is Noman Benotman, a former commander of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Soon after the 9/11 attacks, he distanced himself from Al-Qaeda and later resigned from the LIFG. He's currently the president of Quillian Foundation, which focuses on countering global extremism. He's also the co-founder of the Libyan Human and Political Development Forum. We also have the honor to be joined by Ambassador Edward Chaplin, who was Her Majesty's ambassador to Iraq during the crucial years of 2004 to 2005. Now, with those introductions and administration out of the way, let me jump right into the story of this book, as I was prompted to discuss. And I thought it would be best to share its primary conceptual idea. And then, of course, as this is a history seminar, how the book is rooted in a sense of Libya's history, rather than just what's happened in the last 2.5 years. This should take me about 25 minutes time, after which we'll hear from the two panelists for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll open up the floor for about 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A. So simply put, our book has two faces. On the one hand, it's a piece of disinterested, peer-reviewed scholarship. On the other hand, the book is dedicated to my old colleague, U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens, who, as we know, died tragically in the line of duty in Libya. And it reflects our shared creed of advocating for engagement, institution building, and the linking of Libya to global markets of knowledge, commerce, education, and know-how. I personally came about this creed as a product of my work as a consultant in Libya from 2008 to 2009, and the running of the day-to-day affairs of the U.S. Libya Business Association in 2010. Those formative experiences led me to believe that Libya was somehow fundamentally different than all other countries, and by being plugged into some form of globalization would naturally benefit. And that's a controversial viewpoint and standpoint, so please ask me about that in the Q&A if you're interested, and I can tell you my personal perspective there. As a result of this creed, I founded my own consultancy, LibyaAnalysis.com, to promote economic, cultural, and academic interchanges between Libya and the West. And this book is actually the greatest endeavor so far in forwarding that mission. Unsurprisingly, this creed colored how I grappled with the events of the Arab Spring in Libya, and underlay my op-ed writing and also advocacy on Libya. It led me to co-author a think tank report for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in February 2012. In that report, I put forth my hypothesis that events in Libya were not actually a revolution, but rather a series of disconnected and ill-coordinated uprisings sparked by specific social, economic, tribal, religious, and ethnic forces at play in the country. And moreover, in overthrowing Gaddafi, the disparate rebel militias of the periphery had overthrown the center of power. And they did so without creating any institutional framework which could possibly replace the one they had dislodged. Initially, it appeared that this might be a blessing, but had the potentiality to be a curse. Sadly, in the last few months, it appears that this lack of institutionality is more likely to be a curse for Libya as it moves forward. Now, many countries, especially those in post-conflict zones, lack a strong central government and lack institutions. Paradoxically, their inhabitants are in no rush to create them, as a strong central government and even institutionality reminds them of the tyrannies which they have just ejected. I'd like to argue that Libya is a different story. The Libyan economy is among the least diversified on earth. It's based fairly exclusively on a kind of resources extraction that requires intense inputs of capital and highly skilled, usually foreign labor. This means the country simply can't function efficiently without a strong central government to draw up infrastructure plans, secure the pipelines, disperse welfare, tender projects, respect contracts. Seeing the Arab Spring as a new dawn where Western powers could move from their traditional roles of supporting unpopular autocrats to supporting the peoples of the Arab world in their quest for better lives and self-governance, I began advocating for foreign capacity building assistance in helping the new Libyan government forge strong institutions and do the things like Richard's projects have done in building hospitals, building schools, training policemen. And the whole hope was that that would be a counterbalance to Gaddafi's legacy, but also to the centrifugal forces of the uprising pulling towards the periphery. Now, as soon as I hit on this paradigm, I wondered if the weak Libyan center was merely a product of the Gaddafi regime and its unique form of ideological authoritarianism, or if in fact Libya's unique statelessness was rooted in its earlier history and the particular Libyan experience of regionalism, outside intervention, and a unique pattern of colonial state formation. Maybe one which is different than anywhere in the world, but might be closest to Algeria, and if you're interested, I can draw out that parallel. So to flesh out this argument and its myriad implications for the post-Gaddafi Libya, I thought a book-length treatment was needed. And fortunately for me, these ideas dovetail with my doctoral work. Also, my view of the multifaceted nature of the uprisings lent itself to an edited volume, as each contributor could analyze a discrete aspect. As I certainly didn't know enough about the specifics of, say, the role of Islamists, or say, the role of outside actors, or other things like ethnic minorities, this made me reach out to my contacts and colleagues who had unique insights into these different realms of Libya and were occasionally the world expert in their specific domains. I found it interesting and fascinating working with those who had significant time on the ground and personal contact with the key actors in the drama. We're honored that The two contributors who I co-authored chapters with are with me here today. They've not only written about the history of Libya, but have helped shape it. I was told by an old mentor of mine that every book should tell a story or develop the implications of a single idea. And this is particularly true of works of history. There are certain ideas that edited volumes don't necessarily have to be focused around this single idea. And here's where I disagree. I think that a book tells a story, and an edited volume should be no different. Now, sometimes the story is one narrative, manifestly contained in the pages of the book. Sometimes there's also a backstory hidden between the lines. Our book looks at the vectors of tribalism, oil, ethnic minorities, economy, role of foreign powers, civil activism, Islamists, and institutions, historically seeking to uncover how each of these dynamics led into the uprisings and were then in turn transformed by them, and lastly, how those same vectors still play out now in what we term the struggle for the post-Qadhafi future. This approach has served to situate the uprisings in the broader continuum of Libya's history. It also allows the reader to grasp how the current political vacuum in Libya and the competition for power has not sprung from nowhere, and is in fact not merely a product of the standard chaos that accompanies regime change or outside intervention, but is rather deeply rooted in Libya's unique history. So what am I going to do now with my remarks? I'm going to first look at the Libyan uprisings and what made them different than their sister movements in Tunisia and Egypt. Then I'm going to jump backwards in time to see how what I term the ascendancy of the periphery is deeply rooted in Libyan statelessness and the unique patterns of local organization from its late Ottoman and 20th century history to the present. Okay, a tall order, no doubt, so let's get to it. The ancien regimes in Tunisia and Egypt were famous for possessing strong institutions. Trade unions in Tunisia, conscription army in Egypt and Tunisia, literate civil societies that we're aware of, the great intelligentsias of Tunis and Egypt. Gaddafi's Libya lacks all these things. So when the revolutionary situation arose in Libya, in Libya and Tunisia and Egypt, excuse me, and I have a little bit of hay fever, so that's a second, excuse me. These pre-existing social institutions were able to be galvanized by the youth and swing over en masse to support the rebellion. So the occupation of symbolic locations in Tunis and Cairo was able to quickly lead to the collapse of the legitimacy of the ancien regime. Devoid of this legitimacy, the institutions that I described, most specifically the bureaucracy and the army in Egypt and Tunisia, were no longer loyal to their autocrats, and this caused a swift decapitation of the regime at the center. In this way, I like to look at the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt as akin to a popular military coup, and entirely dissimilar to a low-intensity civil war or an asymmetric insurgency like what's now unfolding in Libya, what's now unfolding in Syria and already unfolded in Libya. Like after most successful military coups, especially relatively bloodless ones, the powers of the Egyptian and Tunisian states were preserved largely intact, and they remained vested in the center rather than in the people. This is why the revolution appears to never cease in Cairo, because successive waves of protesters feel that the central government, first the SCAF, which is the army, or now Mohammed Morsi and the Brotherhood, they hold too much power, and therefore the protesters are galvanized against them. In Libya, the situation couldn't have been more opposite. Gaddafi's ideology of Jamahiriya, meaning massocracy, or in fact, a rule without institution, a fake rule on behalf of the people, and Libya's unique history has prevented the formation of any national institutions. So rather than the revolt beginning in the capital, and the regime quickly fleeing as organized youth and civil society activists turned the bureaucracy and the army against it, the uprising in fact began in Benghazi, which is more than 600 miles away from Tripoli, and is the traditional locus of opposition. The revolt there couldn't have been supported by any truly national institutions like labor unions or a national conscription army, because these simply don't exist in Libya. Hence, those who started rebelling on February 17th, 2011, were primarily secular, Cyrenaican, educated civil society activists. And of course, on their own, they never could overthrow the regime, you know, some disparate civil society activists. What they managed to miraculously do was to spark and inspire disconnected uprisings in other towns and among other social sectors who had very different outlooks. For the most part, this spread of the rebellion did not encroach on the regime's power bases in Tripoli, Sabha, and Sirte, nor did it create truly national institutions. To connect these disparate uprisings, on 27 February 2011, the political class of reformists, mostly associated with the old Gaddafi regime, formed what they called the political face of the uprisings, an umbrella organization to unite the local factions that had dislodged the regime from eastern Libya. And this is, of course, called the National Transitional Council. Over the next months, this NTC defeated the Gaddafi regime in numerous battles, and it obtained international recognition as the sovereign representative of the Libyan people. However, just as it was getting recognition as the sole authority of Libya by international embassies, on the ground in Libya, they were proving to be only one force amongst many. The military dynamics of the uprisings did not favor the NTC. In fact, they strengthened all of these other forces against it. We will now investigate why that was so. The failure of the anti-Gaddafi rebels to quickly decapitate the Gaddafi regime had led to the imposition of a no-fly zone to protect the people of Benghazi from a counteroffensive. Miraculously, the UN and Arab League had approved this no-fly zone. What did the no-fly zone do? It thwarted Gaddafi's attempt to retake eastern Libya in mid-March, but it also gave tremendous advantage to the defense. What did this mean? The poorly disciplined rebel forces under the command of the NTC, or acting separately, were not able to defeat Gaddafian forces in pitched battles or in open territory. But with the no-fly zone, they could hold territory, because Gaddafian attacks could be destroyed. But they couldn't advance on their own into Gaddafian territory. This dynamic allowed the anti-Gaddafi rebels, not formally connected to the NTC, to exist inside Gaddafian territory without facing military annihilation, so long as they controlled whole towns, which could be resupplied by sea, such as Misrata, famously, and via the Tunisian border or Qatari helicopters, such as Zintan in the Nafusa Mountains. Without this no-fly zone, these pockets of resistance inside Gaddafi territory would largely have been obliterated by Gaddafi's tanks and planes, or they would have merged into the rebels' nascent political and command and control structures. In short, the no-fly zone functioned like the internet. It was a democratizing force